Berlin, April 22nd, 1945, 3:30 in the afternoon. In a concrete bunker 8.5 meters beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, Adolf Hitler's voice rose to a shriek that penetrated the steel doors of the conference room. The officers standing around the map table had never heard him like this. Not in 12 years of following him. His left hand trembled violently against his leg as he screamed that the war was lost, that everyone had betrayed him, that he would stay in Berlin and shoot himself. Then something unprecedented happened. The Führer, who had never admitted weakness, who had promised victory even as Soviet shells fell on the streets above, sat down heavily and began to weep. 53 days remained until Germany's unconditional surrender. For the men who had built the Third Reich, time itself had become an enemy more implacable than any army. And in their final words, in their desperate acts, in the moment they could no longer deny what was coming, they revealed something more human and more terrible than their propaganda had ever shown. The collapse had been building for months, but they had refused to see it. In January, when Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz, Goebbels had written in his diary that the reports were exaggerated, that the Allies were manufacturing atrocity propaganda. When the Americans crossed the Rhine in March, Hitler had issued the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all German infrastructure, all factories, all bridges, all food stores. If Germany could not win, he reasoned, Germany did not deserve to survive. Albert Speer, his Minister of Armaments, had read the order with growing horror. For the first time in 12 years of loyalty, he chose to disobey. But Hitler still spoke of victory. In his daily military conferences, he moved phantom divisions across maps, ordering attacks by units that no longer existed, planning counter-offensives with armies that had been destroyed weeks earlier. His generals stood silent, unwilling to contradict him, watching as he pushed around markers representing men who were dead or captured or fleeing westward in desperate columns. The tremor in his left hand grew worse. He walked with a stoop, dragging his left leg. His secretaries noticed he had aged decades in months. Then on April 12th, news arrived that briefly ignited something like hope. Franklin Roosevelt had died of a cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs, Georgia. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, and perhaps his most fanatical believer, telephoned the bunker immediately. His voice shook with excitement as he reminded Hitler of the miracle of the House of Brandenburg when the Russian Empress Elizabeth had died during the 7 Years' War, saving Frederick the Great from certain defeat. This was it, Goebbels insisted. The alliance against them would fracture. The Americans and British would realize the true enemy was Bolshevism. Germany would be saved. Hitler allowed himself to believe it for perhaps 48 hours. He ordered champagne brought up from the Chancellery cellars. He spoke to his staff about the turning point, about how history proved that perseverance always triumphed. But the Red Army continued its advance. The Americans did not halt. The British bombers still came. By April 14th, Soviet forces were within the city limits of Berlin. The miracle had not come. On April 20th, Hitler made his last public appearance, emerging from the bunker to inspect a group of Hitler Youth defenders in the Chancellery Garden. A cameraman filmed him moving along the line of boys, some as young as 12, patting their cheeks, murmuring words of encouragement. His hand trembled as he pinned medals on their chests. It was his 56th birthday. The footage shows a man who looks 70, stooped and shuffling, his left arm held stiffly against his body. The boys stared at him with a mixture of devotion and uncertainty. Within days, most of them would be dead, killed defending buildings that could not be defended, buying hours that meant nothing. That evening, his inner circle gathered for what would be their last celebration together. Goering was there, and Himmler, and Speer, and Goebbels, and Bormann. They stood in the bunker's conference room, drinking champagne, offering birthday congratulations that rang hollow against the sound of artillery fire growing closer. One by one, they urged Hitler to leave Berlin, to fly south to Berchtesgaden, where he could continue directing the defense. He refused. Berlin was where he would make his stand. Berlin was where it would end. By April 22nd, the situation had become undeniable. Soviet forces had encircled the city. The Ninth Army, which Hitler had counted on to relieve Berlin, had been destroyed. General Helmuth Weidling, the city's defender, reported that ammunition would last perhaps 2 more days. Food was running out. The civilian population was trapped between the advancing Soviets and the SS execution squads, shooting anyone who showed white flags. That afternoon's military conference began like all the others. Hitler bent over the maps, demanding to know why General Steiner's attack had not begun. His officers exchanged glances. There was no attack. Steiner's forces did not exist in any meaningful strength. Someone finally said it aloud. The attack had not taken place. It could not take place. Hitler's face went white, then red. He began to scream. Everyone had lied to him. Everyone had betrayed him. The generals were cowards and traitors. The SS were incompetent. The entire German people had proven themselves unworthy of his genius. His voice rose until it cracked. The war was lost. He had been betrayed on all sides. He would stay in Berlin. He would shoot himself when the Russians came. The officers stood frozen. In 12 years, they had never heard him admit defeat. He had always found some reason for hope, some counterattack to plan, some miracle to invoke. Now he sat slumped in his chair, tears running down his face, his trembling hand pressed against his forehead. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then, quietly, they began to leave the room, but the next day, Hitler was planning again. The breakdown had passed. He was calmer now, resigned but still issuing orders. He would stay in Berlin, yes, but the government would continue. He began thinking about succession, about who would lead Germany after he was gone. And he began thinking about the men he had trusted most, the men who were, even then, betraying him. Hermann Göring had left Berlin on April 20th, flying south to Berchtesgaden with trainloads of art looted from across Europe. He was Hitler's designated successor, named in a decree from 1941. On April the 23rd, from the safety of Bavaria, Göring sent a telegram to the bunker. He had heard reports that Hitler was surrounded, that communication was difficult. The telegram was carefully worded, almost obsequious, but its meaning was clear. Given the circumstances, should Göring assume leadership of the Reich as Hitler's designated successor, he would wait for a reply by 10 o'clock that evening. If he heard nothing, he would assume Hitler had lost his freedom of action and would take control himself. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and perhaps the most hated man in the inner circle, brought the telegram to Hitler. Bormann had always despised Göring, had worked for years to undermine him. Now he saw his opportunity. He suggested to Hitler that this was not a request. This was an ultimatum. Göring was trying to seize power while Hitler still lived. It was treason. Hitler's rage returned, colder now and more focused. Göring, who had been with him since the beginning, who had built the Luftwaffe, who had stood beside him through the years of struggle, was a traitor. At 8:30 that evening, Hitler sent his reply by telegram. Serge Göring was stripped of all his offices, expelled from the party, ordered to resign immediately for health reasons. If he refused, he would be executed. SS troops in Berchtesgaden placed Göring under house arrest. The man who had once been second in the Reich sat in his villa, surrounded by his stolen art, and waited to see if he would live through the week. But Göring's betrayal was nothing compared to what came next. On April 28th, a BBC radio broadcast reported that Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS, architect of the Holocaust, had offered Germany's surrender to the Western Allies. Himmler had met secretly with Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, proposing that Germany would surrender to Britain and America, but continue fighting the Soviet Union. He believed the Western powers would accept that they would want Germany as a buffer against Bolshevism. Someone turned on the radio in the bunker so Hitler could hear the report himself. The BBC announcer's voice was crisp, factual, devastating. Himmler, der treue Heinrich, loyal Heinrich, the man Hitler had trusted with the SS, with the concentration camps, with the final solution, had tried to negotiate surrender behind his back. Hitler's reaction was beyond rage. His face turned grey. He screamed that this was the worst treachery of all, that Himmler's betrayal cut deeper than any military defeat. He ordered Himmler's SS liaison officer in the bunker, Hermann Fegelein, arrested immediately. Fegelein, who was married to Eva Braun's sister, was found drunk in his apartment, preparing to flee. He was shot in the Chancellery Garden on April the 29th. That same day, Hitler decided to marry Eva Braun. She had been his companion for years, kept hidden from the public, never acknowledged. Now, in the final hours, he would make it official. A municipal councillor named Walter Wagner was brought to the bunker after midnight. He was in Volkssturm uniform, having been pulled from the defense lines. In the bunker's map room, with Goebbels and Bormann as witnesses, Wagner performed the brief civil ceremony. Hitler and Eva both had to confirm they were of pure Aryan descent and free of hereditary diseases. Eva began to sign her name as Eva Braun, then crossed it out and wrote Eva Hitler. The ceremony lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Afterward, they drank champagne with the witnesses. Then Hitler retired to his study and began dictating his last will and political testament to his secretary, Traudl Junge. His voice was calm now, almost detached. He had made his decision. He knew what was coming. The testament was a final accounting, a last attempt to shape how history would remember him. He began by justifying the war. He had not wanted it, he claimed. It had been forced upon him by international Jewry. He had tried for peace. The responsibility lay with the Jews and with the British and American politicians who served them. He expressed no regret for the millions dead, for the cities destroyed, for the continent in ruins. Instead, he blamed the German people for not being worthy of his vision. They had failed him. He dealt with the betrayals methodically. Goering and Himmler were expelled from the party, stripped of all rights. Their treachery, he wrote, had brought immeasurable shame upon the country and the entire National Socialist movement. He named Admiral Karl Dönitz as Reich President and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. Goebbels would be Reich Chancellor. Other positions were assigned to men whose names meant nothing, who would hold office for days or hours before the final collapse. Then he turned to his personal will. He had decided to die rather than fall into enemy hands. He and his wife would commit suicide. Their bodies were to be burned immediately. He had no desire to become a spectacle for the masses or for the Jews. Everything he owned he left to the party, or, if the party no longer existed, to the state. His paintings and art collection would go to a gallery in Linz, the city of his youth. He appointed Martin Bormann as executor. He ended with a final exhortation. The German people must continue the struggle against international Jewry. Above all, he charged the leadership and followers of the nation to uphold the racial laws scrupulously and to resist mercilessly the poisoner of all nations, international Jewry. He signed it at 4 in the morning on April the 29th. Goebbels and Bormann witnessed it. Then he added a brief appendix, naming Goebbels as Reich Chancellor and listing the members of the new government. Goebbels immediately wrote his own appendix, refusing Hitler's order to leave Berlin. For the first time in his life, he wrote, he must categorically refuse an order from the Führer. In the nightmare of treachery that surrounded Hitler in these most critical days, there must be at least someone who stayed with him unconditionally until death. He and his wife had decided to end their lives in the capital alongside Hitler. Their children would die with them. It was the only honorable course. On April 30th, Hitler spent the morning making final arrangements. Copies of his testament were given to 3 officers with orders to break through Soviet lines and deliver them to Dönitz. He said goodbye to the bunker staff, shaking hands with each person, murmuring thanks for their service. His secretaries noticed he seemed calmer than he had been in weeks, almost relieved. The decision had been made. The uncertainty was over. Around noon, he lunched with his secretaries and his cook in the narrow corridor outside his rooms. He spoke quietly about his dog, Blondie, who had been poisoned with cyanide that morning to test the capsules. He talked about the past, about the early days of the party, about better times. No one mentioned the future because there was no future to mention. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva retired to their private suite. He had a Walter pistol. She had a cyanide capsule. The bunker staff waited in the corridor outside, smoking, speaking in whispers. At approximately 3:30, they heard a single gunshot. Otto Günscher, Hitler's SS adjutant, waited several minutes, then opened the door. Hitler sat on a small sofa, his head tilted forward, blood running from his right temple where he had shot himself. Eva sat beside him, dead from cyanide. The smell of almonds and gunpowder filled the small room. Günscher and Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet, wrapped the bodies in blankets and carried them up the stairs to the emergency exit leading to the Chancellery garden. Soviet artillery fire was heavy. They placed the bodies in a shallow crater, poured gasoline over them, and set them alight. The bodies burned for several hours, while the staff threw on more gasoline. The remains were eventually buried in a shell crater, then dug up and reburied several times over the following days as Soviet forces closed in. That evening, Joseph Goebbels became Reich Chancellor for less than 24 hours. He attempted to negotiate with the Soviets, sending General Hans Krebs under a white flag to Soviet lines. Krebs spoke Russian, having been military attaché in Moscow before the war. He informed the Soviet commanders that Hitler was dead and requested a ceasefire. The Soviets demanded unconditional surrender. Goebbels refused. There would be no surrender while he lived. On May 1st, as Soviet forces entered the government district, Goebbels made his final decision. Around 8:30 in the evening, his wife Magda went to the room where their 6 children slept. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, had been given morphine. Magda crushed cyanide capsules into each child's mouth. Their names were Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, and Haida. All their names began with H for Hitler. When it was done, Magda came out of the room and sat silently, smoking a cigarette. Around 8:45, Joseph and Magda Goebbels climbed the stairs to the Chancellery garden. An SS man waited with pistols. The exact sequence is uncertain, but both took cyanide and were shot, either by the SS man or by each other. Their bodies were partially burned, but left recognizable. Soviet troops found them the next day. Dönitz, from his headquarters in northern Germany, announced Hitler's death in a radio broadcast on the evening of May 1st. He lied about how Hitler had died. The Führer, Dönitz said, had fallen this afternoon at his command post in the Reich Chancellery, fighting to his last breath against Bolshevism. It was the final piece of Nazi propaganda, the last attempt to shape the narrative. Hitler had not fought. He had shot himself in a bunker while his capital burned above him. Sir, Dönitz attempted to form a functioning government, to negotiate some kind of conditional surrender that would preserve German sovereignty. The Allies refused to negotiate. On May 7th, at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. Dönitz's government was arrested on May 23rd. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had lasted 12 years and 4 months. Hermann Göring had survived in his villa in Berchtesgaden, still under house arrest when American troops arrived on May 9th. He surrendered to the Americans, expecting to be treated as a head of state negotiating terms. Instead, he was stripped of his medals, his marshal's baton, his ornate uniforms. At Nuremberg, he would attempt to dominate the trial, to justify everything, to defend Hitler, even as he tried to save himself. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On October 15, 1946, hours before his scheduled execution, he swallowed a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled to him. His last words, written in a final letter, showed no remorse, only defiance. He regretted nothing. Heinrich Himmler had fled Berlin before the end, attempting to disappear into the chaos of Germany's collapse. He shaved his mustache, wore an eye patch, carried papers identifying him as a discharged sergeant. On May 23rd, at a British checkpoint near Hamburg, guards became suspicious. They detained him for questioning. When a doctor attempted to examine his mouth, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his teeth. He died within 15 minutes, thrashing on the floor, unable to speak. The man who had ordered the deaths of millions died anonymously in a British interrogation room, his last act a final exercise of control over his own fate. Albert Speer survived. He surrendered to the Allies, cooperated extensively, provided detailed testimony about the regime's inner workings. At Nuremberg, he was the only defendant to accept responsibility, though he claimed ignorance of the Holocaust's full extent. He was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison. He served the full sentence, was released in 1966, and spent his remaining years writing memoirs that portrayed him as the good Nazi, the one who had tried to stop the madness. He died in 1981. Having outlived all the others, having shaped his own narrative more successfully than any of them. But in those final days, in the bunker beneath Berlin, none of them had been thinking about how history would judge them. They'd been thinking about the immediate, terrible present, the sound of Soviet artillery growing closer, the smell of concrete dust and unwashed bodies and fear. The knowledge that everything they had built was collapsing, that the power they had wielded was gone, that they faced either death or capture and trial. Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, who had typed his final testament and witnessed his last hours, would spend the rest of her life trying to understand how she had served such a man, how she had not seen what was happening around her. In her memoir, written decades later, she described the surreal atmosphere of those final days. The formal meals served on fine china, while the world ended above them. The birthday party for one of the staff, while Soviet troops fought block by block toward the bunker. The way Hitler would rage about betrayal, and then calmly discuss his dog. The disconnect between the enormity of what was happening and the mundane details of daily life underground. She remembered the moment she realized it was truly over. Not when Hitler shot himself, but earlier, when she saw him sign his testament and understood that he had accepted death. For years, she had believed in him, had thought he would somehow save Germany, that his genius would find a way. The testament destroyed that illusion. It was not a plan for victory. It was a suicide note dressed up as a historical document. He was not thinking about how to win. He was thinking about how to be remembered. The other staff members had their own moments of realization. For some, it came when Hitler admitted the war was lost on April 22nd. For others, it came when the Soviet shelling grew so close they could hear individual explosions, could feel the bunker shake with each impact. For some, it came when they saw Hitler's body being carried up the stairs, wrapped in a blanket, his face covered. The man they had followed, who had seemed invincible, reduced to a corpse to be burned in a shell crater. What did they say in those final moments? The record is fragmentary, preserved in testimony given years later, in memoirs written to justify or explain or simply to remember. But certain phrases recur. Hitler's secretary recalled him saying, during those last days, that the German people had failed him, that they did not deserve his vision. Speer remembered Hitler speaking about the racial laws, insisting they be maintained even in defeat. Goebbels, in his final diary entries, wrote about honor, about dying with dignity, about refusing to live in a world without National Socialism, but perhaps the most revealing statement came not from words, but from actions. When Hitler shot himself, when Goebbels poisoned his children, when Goering and Himmler took cyanide rather than face justice, they were making a final declaration. They would control their own ends. They would not submit to judgment. They would not allow the world to see them powerless. It was the ultimate expression of the ideology they had built. Power was everything. To lose power was to lose meaning. They had lived by force, by dominance, by the assertion of will over reality. When reality finally became undeniable, when the Soviet tanks were in the streets and the Americans were at the gates and there was nowhere left to run, they chose annihilation over accountability. The Third Reich had promised a new order that would last a millennium. It lasted 12 years. It killed tens of millions. It destroyed a continent, and in the end, its leaders died in a bunker or by their own hand, leaving behind only ruins and corpses and the question of how such evil had been possible. Time had turned against them, not in some mystical sense, but in the most concrete way imaginable. The years of conquest had become years of retreat. The millions of soldiers had become mass graves. The conquered territories had become killing fields and then battlegrounds and then lost ground. The future they had promised had become a present of ash and blood and defeat. And when time finally ran out, when there were no more tomorrows to promise and no more yesterdays to glorify, they faced the moment they had created. Not with courage or wisdom or even genuine remorse, but with rage and denial and one final assertion of will. They would choose how they died, even if they could no longer choose how they had lived. The bunker was captured by Soviet forces on May 2nd. They found Goebbels' partially burnt body, identified by his gold party badge and his club foot. They found the children in their beds. They found Hitler's dental remains in the garden crater, identified later by his dentist's records. They found documents and maps and the detritus of a government that had ceased to exist. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945. In cities across the Allied nations, people celebrated in the streets, dancing and crying and embracing strangers. In Germany, there was a mostly silence. The cities were rubble. The dead numbered in the millions. The survivors faced occupation, starvation, the knowledge of what had been done in their name. And in the ruins of Berlin, in the captured bunker beneath the destroyed chancellery, Soviet soldiers walked through the rooms where the Nazi leadership had spent their final days. They saw the cramped quarters, the maps still on the walls, the half-eaten meals left on tables. They saw the room where Hitler had died, the blood stain on the sofa, the bullet hole in the wall. It looked smaller than anyone had imagined. Less grand, less significant. Just concrete rooms underground, where frightened men had hidden from the consequences of their choices, where they had raged and wept and finally died, believing to the end that they were the victims of history rather than its architects. Time had not turned against them. They had simply run out of it, and in running out of time, they had run out of lies to tell themselves, run out of other people to blame, run out of everything except the truth they had spent 12 years trying to destroy. The truth that power built on murder cannot last. That conquest built on hatred cannot stand. That a regime built on lies will eventually collapse under the weight of reality. In the end, time was simply the measure of how long it took for that truth to become undeniable. And when it did, when the last illusions fell away and there was nothing left but the choice between facing justice or choosing death, the leaders of the Third Reich made their final decision. They chose death. And in choosing it, they wrote the final chapter of their own story, the one that would be remembered when all their promises of glory and thousand-year empires were forgotten. They had promised to remake the world. Instead, they destroyed themselves. And the words they spoke in those final days, the rage and the blame and the refusal to accept responsibility, became not a testament to their greatness, but an epitaph for their failure. A failure so complete that even their deaths could not dignify it, could only punctuate it with one last act of cowardice dressed up as defiance.